Thank you for joining me for part 6 of our current series of study called Wife versus Female. Now, this entire series has been centered on the subject of the truth about women in ministry. Because what we've been able to see is that over the past 2,000 years, what has taken place is that certain false doctrines have been propagated and perpetuated through translation bias and an approach to Scripture which, in many respects, disregards scriptural and historical context. And in this series of study, we have placed our focus on 3 Scripture passages which have been problematic since they've been used in such a way as to promote doctrine which is not in alignment with what Scripture says in other places. And since we are admonished to allow Scripture to interpret Scripture, these verses have been brought to our attention for further study. The 3 passages that have been the focus of our study are 1 Corinthians 11, verses 3 to 12, 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 to 15, and 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34. And in this segment of our study, we're looking at 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34. So let's begin. And so let's begin by looking at 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34, within its immediate context. First Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also says the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. End of quote. Which brings us to our first question. What law? Okay, so we're going to come back to the answer to that question, but first, let us consider what is being proposed to be said to us in this verse, because at face value, with a literal reading of this verse, one might automatically think that Paul is saying that wives or women are not allowed to speak in the assembly. In fact, let's look at that word silence. That word looks very familiar because we actually looked at the meaning of the word silence as it appeared in the translation of the passage in 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 and 12. So let's read that passage again. 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 and 12. Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. End of quote. Now, in the last segment of our study, we did a word study of the word translated here from the Greek as silence in 1 Timothy 2 verses 11 to 12. And we found that when we looked at the definition of the word, it does not mean to not speak or be muted, but rather this word silence, which is Strong's number G2271, speaks of a heart attitude of humility, where one is not a busybody, but instead is involved in one's own work and not meddling in the lives of others. Now, we saw that Paul used this word silence in instructions given to both men and women, husbands and wives. And so if you did not watch the previous part of this series, part 5, please refer to part 5 for the verse details where we looked at this word and saw other instances where this word is used in addressing men or husbands as well as wives. And so here we see this word silence in 1 Timothy. However, here in 1 Corinthians 14 verses 34 to 35, it is a different Greek word that has also been translated as silence in the English. In 1 Corinthians 14 verses 34 to 35, the word silence is Strong's number G4601, and it means to hold one's peace and to be concealed, as in the case of holding back words or not speaking. And we look at other verses where the same word is used in the original text. We see examples of that being exactly what is meant by that word. For example, Luke 20, verse 26, Acts 12, verse 17, and Acts 15, verse 12. So let's read them. Let's read these verses together. These are other instances where the same word is used as in 1 Corinthians 14:34. Luke 20, verse 26, and they could not take hold of his words before the people, and they marveled at his answer and held their peace. That word peace is the same word as that has been translated in 1 Corinthians 14 as silence. Acts 12, verse 17, but he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. End of quote. And then Acts 15, verse 12. Then all the multitude kept silence and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders Elohim, or God, had wrought among the Gentiles by them. End of quote. So again, all three instances here are Strong's number G4601, and it has the same word has been translated as either silence or peace, and it does in fact mean to not speak. And so clearly in this passage in 1 Corinthians 14, the word used is a different word in the original text from the word that was used in 1 Timothy. And in the case of 1 Corinthians 14, this word clearly means not to speak. Now, in the last segment, we talked about how the historical context of Paul's words of instruction were clearly a response to a specific situation where it was necessary for Paul to specifically address some of the pagan beliefs of some of the new believers who were coming into the assembly after having been involved in the religious cults of Artemis and other Greek mythology. And as we saw, Paul's instructions were not that women or wives could not speak in the assembly, but rather Paul boldly refuted the false beliefs and gave instruction for the women to learn the truth in a spirit of meekness, that word silence. But he never said that they could not speak in the assembly. And he never said that it was a shame for women to speak in the assembly. Not even when Paul was speaking to women who came from a background of pagan religion. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 3 to 12, Paul does not forbid women from speaking in the assembly. In fact, he gave instructions specifically to women or wives for how they were to, in fact, pray and prophesy. Not that they should not pray or prophesy, which would then require them to speak. He gave instructions as to how to pray and prophesy, which then gives instruction to speak. Now, we haven't even given discussion to the fact that in Joel 2, verse 28, and Acts 2:17, the Most High speaks to us with these words and reveals to us something of His plan and purpose. Let's read that together. Joel 2:28 is being quoted in Acts 2:17. It's a matter of fulfillment. In the last days, Elohim says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. End of quote. And so we must ask the question, what law would override the Most High's plans and purposes for His people? Okay, so what is actually being said here? Because these two verses are not in alignment with the other instructions given by Paul to the assembly in general and to women or wives in particular. In fact, these two verses are not in alignment with the implementation of the Most High's plans for the assembly, which is made of both the sons and the daughters of mankind. Well, what becomes clear then is that this is yet another situation where word study, scriptural context, and historical context provides clarity of understanding. And so we have looked at word study and scriptural context, but what about historical context? Well, our clue for historical context is given to us by means of the mention of the law. In studying this passage, we must address this matter of what law is being referred to. And in conducting a search, I found that there is no law given through Moses which says that a woman or a wife cannot speak in an assembly, not in the past and not now. The only mention made of any prohibition of women being prohibited from speaking in the assembly is made in the Babylonian Talmud and in the Tosefta. This is an early rabbinic Tanakh ruling which says, quote, all are qualified to be among the 7 who read from the Torah in the synagogue on the Sabbath, even a minor or women. However, the sages ruled that a woman should not read from the Torah out of respect for the congregation. End of quote. And this is taken from the Babylonian Talmud, Megillah 23a, Tosefta, Megillah 3:11. Now, furthermore, prior to the gatherings of those who believed on Messiah Yahusha, the religious tradition was that women were seated separate from the men and that women did separate prayers for the women. And so, more and more, this passage in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 to 35, sounds like it reflects the sentiment and tradition of the ruling rendered in the Talmud concerning women speaking in the assembly. The words of this passage do not appear to be in alignment with other places where Paul has issued an apostolic mandate saying not only that women can speak by means of prayer and prophesying in the assembly, but also Paul never says that it is a shame for a woman or wife to speak. Paul simply doesn't say that anywhere else. And so it makes it hard to understand why Paul would say that here. And as I prayed and continued to look for understanding, I believe that the Master led me to a teaching given through a brother in South Africa who explained that understanding of this passage is found in just a few points. Number 1, we must remember that this is a letter, a correspondence. In fact, as we noted before, all of Paul's writings are letters, which are a two-way conversation in written format. Paul's letters are not simply theological essays written on certain points. Although Paul's letters do indeed contain some spiritual truth principles that are relevant for us today, some of what is being said is best understood in context. Just like we wouldn't want someone to take something we said out of context because it most certainly could be misunderstood. And so is the case here. Because what we see here is best understood in the context of the verse which follows. So let's look at that. 1 Corinthians 14, now we're looking at the next two verses, which are verses 36 to 40. Well, actually the next four verses. And so right immediately after what we just read in 34 and 35, we see this verse starting with the word, "What? Came the word of Elohim out from you? Or came it unto you alone or only? If any man think himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that I write unto you are the commandments of the Lord. But if any man be ignorant, let him be ignorant. Wherefore, brethren, covet to prophesy, and forbid not to speak with tongues. Let all things be done decently and in order." End of quote. And so, as we can see here in the very next verse, Paul expresses astonishment at the two verses that we read previously, verses 34 and 35. When Paul said, "What?" and Paul then goes on to ask the question, did the word of Elohim come from you? Now, who is the you? Well, it's evidently whoever it was that made the statements in the previous two verses, which were in alignment with the rabbinic rulings of the Talmud and the Tosefta. Paul goes on to say in this segment of the passage, if any man thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that Paul is writing are commandments from the Lord, not traditions coming from man. Paul then says, but if you want to be ignorant, go ahead and be ignorant. You know, Paul speaks very boldly. Paul ends this passage which is addressing the brethren. Now we know that word brethren is not gender specific. It speaks to brothers and sisters. And so in addressing the brothers and sisters, or the entirety of the assembly, he tells both to covet to prophesy, which is he's telling them to desire with zeal to desire to prophesy, which is a speaking gift. And Paul says, do not forbid to speak with tongues, but to do all things decently and in order, which does not mean without speaking, but rather speaks of the order that Paul had prescribed in verses 1 to 34 of this chapter, chapter 14. And so what the brother from South Africa explained was that we must remember to keep all of the letters within the context of a conversation. In the case of the letters to the Corinthians, we know that there were at least 4 letters in the series of correspondence between Paul and those he was writing to in Corinth. 1 Corinthians, the book, what we know to be 1 Corinthians, is written in response to a letter from the Corinthians that we no longer have. And 2 Corinthians was in response to the letter that the Corinthians wrote back to Paul after receiving this letter, which we call 1 Corinthians. And so the problematic passage, 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 to 35, was a passage that Paul was quoting that was taken from the letter from the Corinthians. Paul quoted this passage from their letter so as to respond to it. Perhaps he was responding to something that had been said in the assembly that was reported to him by means of that letter to Paul. Which then explains why this passage is not in alignment with everything else Paul has said on the subject of women speaking in the assembly. Quite simply put, these are not Paul's words, but rather this is Paul quoting something that he wanted to respond to. And therefore we see the importance of taking into consideration historical context, understanding that we only have part of the correspondence that resulted in what we now have as 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But 1st and 2nd Corinthians was a two-way conversation. Hen u'shalom mishpachah, favor and peace family. Well, I thank you for joining me for this segment of our study, and I do look forward to your joining me for our next segment of study. Blessings to you.